Hello and welcome to West Indies on 99.94 Cricket Every Day. My name is Machel Hewitt, one half of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, and not with me, as ever, is Bharat Sundaresan, because, ladies and gents, this is actually a crossover episode. We've got Bharat Sundaresan from Australia on 99.94 DM. But we're going to let West Indies take the lead on this one because we have to get some kind of what do we call it? Consolation prize after that horror tour of Australia. So carrying on, West Indies on 99.94 is your new home for West Indies cricket content, and we'll be dropping into your podcast feed on YouTube or on the 99.94 app several times every week. So please rate, review, and subscribe. And thanks for joining Cricket's Conversation. So Bharat, I said this is a crossover episode. Usually, if Santoki was here, Wi-Fi pending, I'd say Santoki, take it away. But Bharat, how are you? Take it away.
I'm doing very well. And don't forget, Michelle, I am still the Hulk Hogan of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. I was the first ever world champion on this podcast. I think the episode we did, like what it feels like 5 years ago. But you guys have grown in strength literally every week since then. But I'm still the reigning defending champion. So I think more than Hulk Hogan, I'm more like the Brock Lesnar. So I come, I win a title, and then I just go away. So that's been me on the show in the past. But no, it's good to be in a co-hosting position with you to take over from Santo. Okay, look, he's East Indian. I'm kind of my heart, as you well know, beats for the West Indies, always has, and I had the pleasure of sharing the radio commentary box with Ian Bishop and for SEN during this two-match series, and it was awesome fun. Like there were times when only Bish and I knew what we were talking about. I mean, I was singing calypsos for him on air. I'm speaking to him in a Trini accent. I'm talking about Lyman, and we're talking about the geopolitics of the Caribbean, and the Australian journalists or the Australian commentators would just let us be. They're like, okay, these guys seem to be having fun. We'll just let them be. But it was great fun having Ian Bishop with us. But yeah, I mean, it's a narrative we've all seen and heard before, haven't we? West Indies come and they get squashed. I mean, especially the Adelaide Test. If say the order was reversed, right, Michelle? If Adelaide had happened first and Perth had happened second, I think the narrative would have been a little more positive. Because I'll put it this way: I mean, look, it's you and me on a show. We have to bring wrestling analogies, right? We have already spoken wrestling. I have anyway. So if Adelaide was a squash match, like if Adelaide was West Indies being Brooklyn brawler, I think the Perth test it was one of those performances. You know, you look at it and you're like, maybe 2 years from now they might get a shot at the Intercontinental title. Does that make sense to you? I think
It makes total sense. You kind of give that title shot to a young up and comer and you put them over in defeat. but,
yeah.
but it's good to hear. Obviously, I knew you were on with Bish, and I think it was a bit frustrating for depending on where people are at and depending
Hmm.
what particular broadcast company's feed they had to deal with. Obviously, in the UK, I think we had the Fox feed coming through
Fox,
to
yeah.
BT Sport, and I mean, Brian Lara obviously was there as the kind of West Indian representative, and I say this with ultimate respect to Brian Lara, Bish is a different kettle of fish when it comes to commentary because Bish is still currently heavily invested in
Yes.
what goes on in the West Indian domestic game. So probably has a bit more range in terms of looking at the myriad of issues and problems and putting things into context. And I guess going off the back of what you said there about both Perth and Adelaide, and you've been in Australia for a while now. You've seen many a touring side come to Australia, and I guess I want you to explain to me just how out of the norm was that West
Hmm.
Indian performance, though. I mean, I've done some bits and pieces on the Caribbean Cricket
Hmm.
Podcast where I've made reference to tourists who have travelled, whether it be England, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, even New Zealand recently, where
Yeah.
they've got zero in the wins column as well. So based on what you saw in both Perth and Adelaide, try your best to put it in the context of, we'll keep India to one side for a minute, but try to
Oh
put it
yeah,
in the context of touring sides to Australia. How far away was that just the norm?
it was far away from the norm just because, or there are a few factors why it was far away from the norm. Look, you're right. Winning in Australia is not easy. Very few teams have done that. South Africa have done that very quite a few times, and Australia are about to face South Africa. They have to set the record straight at home against South Africa. India, like you said, have won two series back to back in the space of 3 years. But other teams have come and not done well. New Zealand haven't won a test match here in a long time. They won in 2011, but that was a one off. I think that could well be the only test match that they won in this century, and we are already entering the 23rd year of this century. But I think it's in terms of uh, there were periods of play with the West Indies, and I say this with a heavy heart, Michelle,
Mm,
where they did look substandard. Like, they did not look up to international standard on the field, especially. With yes, there were limitations in Adelaide with injuries, and I mean, where else do you see like a 36-year-old club cricketer come and field in a test match, right? I felt bad for him, but I was so sweet to see him pose for the team photo, and then I would see him sign autographs for those kids. I have no idea what those kids would go and tell their friends, like, when they ask him whose signature is that. So yeah, I mean, you would have to be a proper cricket nerd to know who Omar Phillips is, like, as a kid, to go and tell someone else and for them to know who you're talking about. But I think there were periods of play, even in Perth. I go back to the first session where the West Indians started really strongly. They gave
mm.
nothing away. They made life very difficult for the Australians. But then Roston Chase bowling those 4 overs and going for 20 odd. I think after that was the last time the series remained competitive. Yes, I mean, Craig Brathwaite and Tej Narayan Chanderpaul batted beautifully and gave West Indies some hope. In the first test, overall they batted over 200 overs across two innings, which is good to see. But the gulf in class was a bit too evident, which is
Mm.
generally hasn't always been the case. Even when, say, Pakistan and New Zealand, that summer was when Australia ran roughshod. None of the test matches went into day 5. At least West Indies took the Perth test into day 5, but Pakistan was smashed. But you would see like periods where somebody would put their hand up and get a score. Like someone would make 100. Tom Blundell made 100, I remember, famously at the MCG. One bowler would stand out and take like 4 or 5 wickets or make an
Mm.
impression at least. I think here, even the fact that we are celebrating Tej Narayan Chanderpaul for having batted 100 balls, he made 150. And he's like, he's being built up as this great positive story. Oh, West Indies have found themselves a long term test opener. It's true. I mean, it's relative. I'm not taking anything away from what Chanderpaul did. But if that is the biggest takeaway from for a team from that tour, that kind of puts it into perspective about how far the gulf in class was. And I remember having this conversation with Ian Bishop, like around tea time on day 1 at Perth. This is like, see, West Indies, I always compare them, the test team, the bowling team, to one of those soccer teams who play really defensive football, right?
Mm,
A
mm.
very defensive football, and they hit you on the counter. So if West Indies had bowled the way they did, the seamers in particular, in those conditions to a Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or even England, they would have had the opposition 6 for 150. But when you're up against Manas and Usman Khawaja and Steve Smith, who thrive on just batting, who are so hungry to be out there, or,
Mm.
or for that matter, an Indian batting lineup, or even a New Zealand batting lineup, I think that's where and then you just, what's your plan B? What's your plan C? Unfortunately, it is Roston Chase and Craig Brathwaite. I think those were bits where, as a neutral, you had to like say, yeah, I mean, they just were not good enough to compete at this level against an Australian team in these conditions.
I think all that's spot on, and already this is why I was so glad to kind of do this kind of co-hosting gig with you on this episode, because yes, I know West Indian blood bleeds through you, and you want us to do well, but you also are able to offer what I would say a neutral perspective on it. There's no kind of allegiance to
Yeah.
Australia. Okay, there's a bit of allegiance to West Indies, but there's no allegiance to Australia.
Yeah.
But you can offer a bit of a neutral line on it. Um, but speaking of that, because another point that I kind of made about that kind of golfing class. I did say in one of the things we recorded on Caribbean Cricket Podcast that it was, sorry, a 6 year gap since we last went to Australia, and I just don't know, Bharat. I mean, and we turned up with loads of debutants in terms of Australian
Yeah,
conditions.
true.
I just don't know, Bharat, if any international side could have a 6 year gap. I mean, well, technically South Africa, but I don't know if any international side could have a
Yeah,
6 year gap, come to Australia with only four players that had ever been before, and expect to bridge the gap. They could be more competitive. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to try and pretend
yeah.
that the gods are against West Indies and there's nothing
Oh
we
no, no,
could
no, of
do
course not.
about it.
Yeah,
But I just, I mean, to me, it speaks of a world cricket issue where you're almost feeding us to the lions. You already know that Australia already know there's a gap in quality, and then we're turning up every
yeah, yeah.
6 years to get mauled, and everyone question why we've turned up in the first place. Do you think there's a sense of that as well?
It is. I mean, I think what the Australian public or the Australian cricket community was disappointed with was there was so much expectation from this young fast bowling attack.
Mm,
Alzari Joseph, and I saw him in Hobart. I've seen Alzari Joseph in the past, but the way he was bowling during the T20 World Cup in Hobart, when he was hitting 150 regularly and different format, yes, but you could see that there was something really exciting about him. And then you come to Perth, and I really expected him to be the standout. There were two narratives that were playing in my mind. One played out perfectly was Tej Narayan Chanderpaul making runs, or at least spending enough time out there so that
mm,
the Australian commentators have enough time to talk about Chanderpaul and how he looks like Chanderpaul,
yeah.
and also get his name right after a point. And the other thing was, I really expected Alzari Joseph or Jaden Seals to have that one spell. I'm not saying they would have taken 7 for 12, but like a
Mm,
3 wicket burst in one session where people would be like, at least it's good to see a West Indian fast bowler do what we expect from West Indian fast bowlers. Look, I'm the last person to compare this team with the great West Indies team because that happened 40 years ago. It's like, in wrestling terms, like, do we ever compare John Cena with Bruno San Martino or whoever, one of those guys? It's like, I mean, the West Indies have not been a very good team, or forget about not being a very good team. That dominant era ended in '95. In
mm,
3 years, Michelle, it'll be 30 years since that happened, right? Since Australia beat West Indies. And that great dominant era, even if you take it back to 1976, lasted for 19 years.
mm,
So West Indies have not been very good for almost double the time that they were very, very good. So
yeah.
at some point we need to stop, like, looking back all the time. But I guess in an Australian perspective, they had no other. And that was my preview for the first test. Like, the stars of the show leading up to the series were Michael Holding, Brian Lara, Carl Hooper,
Yeah.
and Ian Bishop. Right? I mean, they
Yeah.
were the ones who featured heavily in the promo. So I think that those were the elements that disappointed the Australians. The fact that nobody put their hand up, like an Alzari Joseph had that one spell against Manas Labuschagne, right? So I asked Roston Chase what had happened to him on day one. He said he had a headache. I know him really well. He had a headache, so he couldn't bowl fast. Fair enough. So after he's bowled that spell to Manas, we all expected at least him to have that a couple of bursts at Manas for the Australians in Adelaide. And it didn't happen. I mean, the first 2 overs of that pink ball test, for me, the game finished there. I mean,
Mm,
Alzari, Joseph, and Jason Holder, there was nothing. They were literally, the ball was barely getting to the keeper. I mean, that's an overstatement, but there was no fire at either end. And,
mm,
it kind of ended. And then Craig Brathwaite takes some strange decisions on the field, I must say. Brings on Roston Chase, and before he goes to Anderson Phillip and Markino Mindley, which again didn't make sense. I think those were elements that really, led to this whole talk of, oh my God, West Indies are coming next year. What do we do about it? Because you've already, like, overplayed the nostalgia element this time. So what do you build? I think that's a bigger concern for them than what really happens on the field. Like, what do we put in the promo now? Like Michael Holding said, shh, like, I'm whispering whatever he said, right? Like the
Listen,
the Windies are
Barrett, they did the big like WrestleMania Cena Rock my way
pretty much.
my way promo. How on earth can they plug it again a year from now? I have no idea. But But you know, Barrett, let's take a quick break, and then on the other side, let's talk about, or let's try to talk about an analogy between a side that has been to Australia and won.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
So we're back, people, and we're just gonna I mean, so much has been said about it. You've written a book on it, Bharat, which is soon to come out. So feel free to
Yes.
plug. But we mentioned near the top of the show that, of course, India have, on their two most recent tours of Australia, have turned Australia over. So it's not impossible to win in Australia, and I'm sure England could learn some lessons, given that the Ashes is given primary feature. That England would want to learn some lessons from how India did it, but it seems silly to say what lessons can West Indies learn from India when the gap between West Indies and India is big enough anyway. But before the break, you spoke about the bowlers not living up to their billing, and they didn't. And I agree with you. That was disappointing. I wasn't there live, so I'm eager to see what you say about it. I just got the sense that the bowling attack, and obviously there were injuries for Adelaide, but
Yeah.
I got the sense that the bowling attack didn't quite know the lengths to bowl. I don't know if it was about the Kookaburra ball and not really knowing what you're supposed to do with that ball. And also, I'm actually going to make reference to something you said earlier on as well. I think the lengths they were bowling would have caused weaker sides problems. So maybe they got
Yes.
confused as to why isn't this working? Why is Labuschagne happy to soak up 400 balls and go along serenely? But having seen India turn over Australia with what was a weakened side, quote unquote weakened
Yeah.
side, the last time out, what is the key to success based on how does a touring side do it in Australia? Is it as simple as looking at bowling line and lengths, or do you just need some luck? What does it boil down to for you, Barrett?
I think you need all of that. You definitely need a lot of luck. You definitely need a very fixed plan where everybody buys into it and doesn't alter from it. And you're right. I mean, with the West Indies, like I said in the first segment, they're a side who kind of prey on the opposition batter's weaknesses. I mean, Jason Holder has taken most of his wickets like that. Yes, he's had spells where he's seamed it around and helpful conditions. He's run through sides, but his economy is his greatest strength. But uh, to guys like Manas and Usman Khawaja and Steve Smith, like I said earlier, they're not going to make that mistake, right? You have to come to them. So you have to be braver. You have to be more courageous. Going back to the lengths that the West Indians bowled in Perth, where the ball was doing a lot. Whenever like Kyle Mayers looked the best bowler. I mean, Kyle.
Mm,
I mean, once again, sorry to sum this up. The best bowlers West Indies had throughout the series were Kyle Mayers and Devon Thomas. That
mm,
does not read very good if you are a West Indian fan, right? So and the reason for that was the lengths that they bowled. And you need to be brave. Like even if you go for a few runs, if you just keep bowling fuller, like Alzari Joseph did to David Warner in that first innings in Adelaide, where he gets driven for four 3 times, and then he keeps pushing it up, and then finally the mistake comes. So you need courage, and India showed a lot of courage during the 2020 18-19 was different, where they had a full strength team, but in 2020 2021 they just showed courage. And another way to beat Australia and Australia, South Africa have done it really well, is to kind of always keep up with them. Like what I
mm,
mean by that is one thing India did not allow Australia to do, regardless of what their bowling attack looked like in 2020 2021, was let them make 400 runs. They never got to
mm,
400 runs, right? In the first innings. Even at the Gabba, like people talk about Rishabh Pant's innings and the final day's play, but I think the game was won much earlier, where as well as Manas batted and everybody else batted around him, they were still bowled out within 400. Even in the second innings, where there was so much talk about when will Australia declare, India bowled them out. So they stuck to a plan. India came with a very specific plan, and they had the kind of bowlers to execute it as well, where they said, we'll prey on the fact that these guys won't get out, but we won't let them score either. So Steve Smith wants to make 100, we'll make sure he faces 400 balls. Manas wants to make 100, we'll make sure he'll score 400 balls. And they really altered the way Steve Smith and Manas started thinking about batting. It's only during this summer that Steve Smith has broken out of that shell that India put him into, where, for those kind of batters, they played so much with their ego that it was more about how am I, as Steve Smith, how am I going to thwart their plan to get me out, rather than how am I going to score a double hundred, right? That was the shift in mindset, and that's what India did. And also, they had batters who could just soak in the pressure, right? Like Tej Narayan Chanderpaul and Craig Brathwaite did well in the first innings and the second innings, but you had to do it for longer. Like Pujara batted nearly 1,000 balls both times. He scored a lot of runs in 2018-19 on slightly flatter pitches. In 2020, 2021, he didn't score big runs, but he just got the Australians coming at India in the fast bowlers bowling their fourth spells and their fifth spells. That's the only way to beat Australia and Australia, where you literally tire their bowlers down. Obviously, it's more difficult in a 2-match series as compared to a 4-match series, where by the time you get to test number 3 and 4, the Australian fast bowlers have bowled so many overs because of the gumption you've shown that they have been worn down. Right. And back then, Australia also made the mistake of picking the same attack for all 4 tests. They didn't go Neser or Boland or anyone else back then. So, A, have a great plan. B, you just never, it's a very difficult country to play catch up. Like the West Indies were playing catch up throughout, right? Okay, not winning the toss doesn't help. Who knows? If they had won the toss, maybe they would have been bowled out cheaply.
Go on, yeah, finish that sentence, yeah.
I'm just saying, no offense, but I think Australia would have bowled a lot better on day one in Perth and day one in Adelaide than what the West Indies did. But that's the only way to really compete. Like, kind of not so much focus on beating Australia at their own game, but have a strategy and stick to it and kind of beat them playing your game. I think that's what especially after 36 all out in 2020-21, a game that India dominated and just kind of lost in a freak session where like there were no plays and misses, just edges and catches. Ajinkya Rahane becomes captain, and he says that we'll just beat them at their game by sticking to what we have come here with. We will not move away from our plan. I think that's what visiting teams need, but for that you need some firepower. Like, yes, they lost players, but Shardul Thakur has played so much first class cricket. You can't compare India and West Indies. I know you're not doing that, but that's the blueprint that they and England were piss poor last year. They were clueless. They were as bad as in periods as the West Indies were. At least the West Indies, till the last innings, where you expected there would be one major collapse, right? By then they were gone. They were a defeated lot. So England had so many collapses. At one point, I know I tweeted a video out and I felt really bad about doing it, where Rory Bones was practicing batting, hopping on one leg at the MCG, and Hasib Hamid is hopping on 2 legs. They just lost the plot. They didn't know what had happened to them. So, and if West Indies had played a 5-match series, I'm sure the same thing would have happened to them. Firstly, it would have meant that I would have played 3 of the those test matches, because they were literally that come down to me, Philip Spooner, or me, who I seriously had told my radio station, like, I might get a call tomorrow morning, and I might not show up for work because you might see me on the field. So if you want background information about me, I'll just message it to you in the morning.
Yeah, like you say, I think it's a good reference to say England had lost the plot. I think for West Indies being a weaker side, we had lost the plot by that second in, and I think you're right as well. It's no consolation for any West Indian fan to hear it, but I think if you're a student of the West Indies game, we all expected something like a 77 all out at some point.
Yes.
If anything, I'm just surprised that it was the last innings of the tour that it happened, because I thought it might have happened earlier on, and then the second test becomes even harder, and so on and so forth, which is why I think you're right to say, which you said at the beginning, if the tests had swapped round, I think people are walking out of the series going, well, it was all right,
Yeah. Yeah. He could be Intercontinental Champion in 4 years' time. We're not saying he'll be in the main event at WrestleMania, but.
Listen, we're going to just take one last quick break, and then on the other side, let's talk about plotting the way forward.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
Okay, people, we're back for the final segment of the show. And Bharat, I do want to touch on it. I was umming and ahhing whether I'd ask you because I'm wary that this can come across as bitter. And maybe it is bitter. Maybe I just have to own it and say it sounds bitter. But I am also wary that when I've spoken about it in the past, I've had Australians come up to me and or send us messages and say, no, actually, we think the same. Bharat, I just need to understand, why are some Australian cricket commentators, and we don't need to mention any names, we're not here to mention any names, but why are some so dismissive of, do you know what? I was going to say the West Indies, but I might even say touring sides in general.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it actually, now I've looked at it and had a few days away from it all and spoken to other people, I don't think it's specific to the West Indies. But there were though in that tour. I know obviously you had your own kind of radio broadcasting duty, so you may not have heard it as much, but I'm fairly certain you're familiar with it in general.
Oh, yeah,
There,
very much so.
there were quite a lot of ignorant comments made, bordering sometimes on arrogance. I don't know which one it is. And I guess, again, we said it at the top, but by the end of the tour, there was far too many comments for my liking, which basically said, so what's the point of the West Indies test side? Should they tour Australia? They need to get their house in order. And I don't know, Barrett, it just felt too unkind for me. Maybe we need to hear those harsh words. But
Yeah.
and I know our golden era was a long, long time ago now, but there is a context. We aren't on the same level playing field. And how do you just see all that? Because you and Bish were probably, Carl Hooper, etc., were fighting a losing battle and probably trying to put things in context and say, well, it's a bit deeper than just they're not very good. But what's what for the international audience or those listening to this particular episode? What is all that about? Why is so much of it so kind of disparaging without context? Where's this all come from?
Look, I think from a very Australian concept, Michelle, what I've understood, having lived here for a few years, is that Australia is a very insular country, to start with. Like, it's opening up to the world now, right? The lack of knowledge about what happens outside Australia, and actually at times even within other parts of Australia, is shocking. But that's how it's been. I mean, it's an island cut away from the rest of the world, and they have historically lived in their own little bubbles, long before COVID came along. So it's only in the last 20 years or so Australia as a country is started opening up to other cultures, understanding what happens. I mean, you look at some of those promos, and when you talk about cricket, when the whole, "Come on Aussie, come on" songs that were like, where they would have a different version for each visiting country back in the 80s and 90s. They were downright racist. I mean, they were blatantly racist. I mean, but it was almost, there was a feeling of like, but like it's not, we just take the mickey out of each other. That's what we're doing. We're not, but that's how the society was here. But they've obviously become a lot more sensitive towards just the fact that there are people of other races, there are people of other beliefs who have started calling Australia home, and who have been calling Australia home for a while. But that's just society. But when it comes to sport, they are insular to another level, wherein, especially with cricket, which is, I think, the one national sport which, especially during the summer, and the Socceroos don't play all the time, right? Like, they played in the World Cup, the whole country backed them. Now they're knocked out. It's all gone back to, back. Okay, now let's move on to the cricket. And the thing is, like, unless you have done well on Australian soil, whoever you are, like, I wrote a book on MS Dhoni, but I still think a lot of Australians really don't know who MS Dhoni is because they don't really care about him because he never really had a great record in Australia. He
Mm.
never had like that moment. Yeah, I mean, he won a ODI in Adelaide, hit a six in the last over. But yeah, that doesn't count for much, right? Virat Kohli is revered because of just who he is and how he's been and how valuable he has been for Cricket Australia in terms
Mm.
of marketing and promoting. I mean, he's been marketed and promoted in Australia as much as he's been. Okay, maybe not as much as he's been, but literally it's halfway there to how much
Mm.
he's in the Indian market or that market is made out of Virat Kohli's success and his popularity. So what I have seen over the years is when there is a visiting team, not just with the West Indies, they'll kind of cling on to one or two players, and which all the broadcasters do that, and even the media, and then kind of weave a narrative around the visiting team based on that one guy. Like when New Zealand came, it was all about Kane Williamson in
Mm.
2019-20. Yes, there was brief mentions of Bolt and Saudi, and like how they got excited this time about Jaden Seals. It was Lockie Ferguson in 2019-20, but it was still like it was still Kane Williamson versus Australia, you would have thought. And
Mm.
right before that, when Pakistan came, it was all about Babar Azam versus. And even with India, even now, I mean, the lack of information there exists about even like an Ajinkya Rahane, even though he'd made 3 tours till that point. So when Virat Kohli leaves and Ajinkya Rahane becomes captain, Australia were like, "Oh yeah, this is the guy who made 100 at the MCG," but we don't really know much about him. Like, and honestly, Pujara, they had no, because he spent so much time on their television sets, they had to start learning more about Pujara to talk about him, right? Like, what do you
Mm.
say? How often do you say Siddle bowls, Pujara defense, right? You have
Mm.
to move on from there. So like, I think, but that's just the insular nature of sports coverage in Australia, and it's not just TV commentators. And then once you have like former cricketers, they come, not all of them, but some of them come with that chip on their shoulder as well. Right? Why do I need to do my research? Like, why do I need to talk about? That's not my job, right? Like,
Mm.
I'm here to bring my experience and my name value, brand value to this broadcast. So, I mean, like Kerry O'Keefe I love Kerry O'Keefe because he's one of those few uh, former cricketers turned commentators around the world who does a lot of research. He's almost like Ian Bishop. He'll watch domestic cricket. I
Mm.
know in the past he's tried to be his funny self and got himself in hot water when he said a bunch of things about Pujara. You'll remember in
Mm. Mm.
2018-19 and about someone being from the railways team. And I think he's I think he's learned from that. But others just don't believe in doing that much research, like because. And it's not only their fault, Michelle. It's just the Australian audience as well. They really don't care. Cricket is not as big a sport in Australia, to be honest, where people are so invested in it that they want to know, or a majority of them want to know who the opposition is. They're like,
Mm.
I mean,
Mm.
if it's the Ashes, they're like, yeah, okay, fine. We hate Stuart Broad. We hate anyone who's a pom. I hate that word, but like, anyone who, because you're a pom, we hate you. But
Mm.
again, I mean, if you were to like pull someone aside, an average Joe, and ask him, tell me about Ollie Pope, he'll be like, who the fuck is Ollie Pope, mate? Like,
Mm.
because they're not as invested as crowds in India or even in the Caribbean, where I've been there and people know about people. Like Suresh
Mm.
Raina, I was shocked to know that he was the most popular cricketer in the Caribbean for a brief while. I told him this. I was like, you're barely the most popular cricketer in one half of India. But it's because they make that effort. But it's just the Australian consciousness with sport. It's doesn't matter. Like, you Australian rules football, the National Rugby League, those are the sports that really matter, and they're played by Australians versus Australians mainly. So I think it's more a cultural thing. And look, before I finish, like just looking ahead, what really concerns me, and this has nothing to do with Australia, it's only to do with the West Indies, is what Roddy Estwick told me after he did a press conference one day in Adelaide. He said, "Look, the problem is that our FTP has, and you're more on top of this than I am. According to Roddy Estwick, West Indies are slated to play 18 tests between now and the next 5 years.
Yep.
So we kind of did some math. And so if you're Tej Narayan Chandapal, this is scary. It's a scary stat.
Yep.
Tej Narayan Chandapal, who we were all excited about, he's 26 now. He's played 2 test matches. So when Tej Narayan Chandapal turns 31, let's
Yep.
say he's played every one of those test matches. And let's say he averages 50. Let's say he has a dream run, he averages 50. he would still be averaging 50, having played 20 tests at
Yep.
31. So,
Yep.
you know what I mean? Which is a very, very scary thought when you think of what lies ahead for West Indian cricket. Like, who will be around in 5 years' time? And what's the motivation? Why should I hang around this team for 5 years and play 18 matches? Like, how much money am I going to make with that?
Yep.
Right? Like, yeah, if I am Tej Narayan Chandrapal, honestly, I'm thinking, that little snippet of me playing the hook shot, becoming a happy hooker late at night in Adelaide, I'm going to work on that. Maybe that'll be my next thing, right? I'm going to work on my white ball skills and make a living out of this sport. And that's how I would think. Maybe there are others in the West Indies junior sides who think, okay, 18 tests is 18 tests. I still get to wear the West Indian crest. I mean, you know better about it than I do.
Well, I'm really glad. Sorry, I'm really glad you've made that point right at the very end. And that's, to be fair, Barrett, that's a podcast episode in itself, because Santoki has made a similar point. We leave this Australia tour with everyone talking about Tagenarine and Shandapur. West Indies play 6 Test matches next year, two in Zimbabwe, which haven't even been confirmed, 2 in South
Right.
Africa. Then there's a massive gap, I think, of 4 months till India turn up, and then that's it. So 2 tests with India, and then that's it for the whole year. So as you say,
And then they're back here.
yeah, and then this is exactly the last thing I want to talk about. So for someone like a Tay Shandapur, it's not financially viable to just play Test cricket, and that's for anybody coming up through the West Indies system. You're now the FTP and World Cricket's organizers, sorry, have essentially made it that if you come from an area like the West Indies, you better play T20 cricket, because how are you going to up your financial stakes if you don't try and play T20 cricket? So I fully expect Tage to have to become more of a stroke maker than a crease occupier, if I'm if I'm honest with you.
Yeah.
But finishing then with that reference you just made, West Indies do come back to Australia literally in a not a well, literally a year, yeah, because we'll be back in
Yeah.
the country getting ready for that January tour at the beginning of 2024. I believe this is my beliefs, Barrett. The Australian public have no desire to see West Indies return. To see West Indies return in a year's time. I doubt Australian broadcasters have any desire to see us return in a year's time. And we joke about how do they plug it, but I genuinely don't know how they. It's a freak. It's just a freak nature of the new FTP that we have to go back again.
Yeah.
So I guess I just say this, Barrett. Realistically, not a whole lot can change between now and when West Indies return. Yes, we may well compete better in South Africa. I'd assume we'd still lose. I'd like to believe that Jasprit Bumrah won't just run for us again when India turn up in the
Yeah.
summer next year. But then, even once India go in the summer next year, there's then a 6-month gap before we then play Test cricket again, and it's back in Australia. What, what would you ideally? What do you think is realistic for the West Indies to do next time in Australia?
Ooh, that's a tough one. And the scarier bit, Michelle, is we can't forget that the West Indies were here as a team since October or late
Mm-mm.
September, right? They play that T20 series against Australia and get humiliated in the T20 World Cup. So it's not even like maybe 4 years ago you could have said, okay, let's convert this Test series as an idea into a T20 series. You'll have Bravo and Gale and Pollard and Russell, and it'll be a highly competitive. Like you can at least sell it. Like there's a brand to sell.
Mm.
That's gone as well, right? Like yeah, I mean, you saw what they did. I was there in Hobart for all their games in the T20 World Cup. It was. I saw their first training session, and I told my colleague, "Man, I've seen a lot of West Indies teams in my time. Warm up, practice, in training. There just seems something like there's no fizz about this team.
Yeah.
They like even when Marlon and Chris Gale wouldn't get along, weren't seeing eye to eye. There was still some energy about training sessions like with the West Indies. Like that, I knew then that this is not going to end well. So what do you do? Like,
Barrett, can I just
I
stop
mean,
you? Let me stop you there. I just want to point out to those listening as well that you sent me a message after that first training session as well. I remember it.
yeah,
You sent me a message, and I won't say to people exactly what your message said, but that message was actually a foreshadow of what was to come. I've still got it on my phone, and you said that you
yeah,
sensed that something wasn't right. And as as that tournament unfolded, I was like, "What on earth did Bharat see that gave it away?" So I do want people to just know that Bharat is telling one hundred
Yes.
percent the truth here.
No, no, thanks for that. Yeah, yeah, I did. Because I had to message someone. I knew I had to message you guys. I'm like, dude, something's not right. Like this is not they're not going to coast into round two and make an impact. Could have end right here, and which it did. Like, even seeing them warm up that morning against Scotland, it was cold. It was cold and rainy. It wasn't great weather conditions, but there was no energy about them. And if you remember, 6 overs, George Munsey played a lot of shots, and there was a rain break. And as they
Mm.
walked off, they didn't even walk off together. There were lots of hand wringing, and people weren't happy with each other. There was a DRS which had been taken, which people weren't happy about. So it was not looking good at all. So that option is ruled out. I actually brought this up on radio once. Like, what do you do? One suggestion, I won't say which former Australian cricketer who actually does take interest in cricket came up with. He said maybe have an above 50s tournament, maybe above 50s series, so they're still thinking maybe have Haynes and Greenwich and Richards and Richardson. Look, Richie Richardson's gonna be here. I can't wait to meet him. I'm gonna quiz him. I'm gonna make sure he's fit next year. Do you know recently he won a golf tournament wearing his famous Richie Richardson hat? He sent me a picture, which is really cool. Someone challenged him. He said, "Okay, I'm gonna take you down for a case of beer or 3 cases of beer, whatever it was." But yeah, I mean, this really no narrative. At least for the Australian public, the first fear was originally they felt that West Indies would come during the marquee part of the summer, like come and play Boxing Day and the New Year's Test.
Mm.
And then Nick Hockley, the CEO, came and said, "No, no, no, that'll be Pakistan because our summer starts later and West Indies will come in January." Firstly, I really don't know where they're going to host those games, because now that Pakistan are playing Melbourne and Sydney, the rest, Adelaide, Perth, Brisbane, will be it'll be a royal rumble to get that third Pakistan test. Because honestly, and this is not to disparage the West Indies, I would be the last person to do that. Nobody wants to host a West Indies test after the way the series played out, which was
I'm
kind
not
of
surprised,
expected.
Barrett. I'm not
Yeah, I
surprised, and
mean,
I'm glad you said it because I thought that one of the things that I think they'll do is they'll try and I say this with respects to whichever particular state it refers to or area it refers to, they'll go to the quote unquote lesser
yeah.
cricket stadiums because that's we're like an indie team, right? So we're gonna we're gonna have to they'll put us in the bingo hall. You know what I mean? So,
No, no, it's true, and we are, if anything, trying our level best to be kind here, right? Like, we are, both you and I are. Like, it is that bad. It is that sad. And look, and I really do hold world cricket. I'd say world cricket is the culprit, and I've said this to whoever I had a chat about this too. That the problem is that, and I said this on air one day with Ian Bishop on air, and poor Ian Bishop didn't know how to respond, considering he's more a global voice than, or at least he's more has that worldly voice reputation than I do. I am a maverick anyway. So I said, like, I hate the fact that world cricket loves to romanticize about West Indies cricket. Say, oh, they were so great. Oh man, when Marshall bowled and Garner did this, and wouldn't it be great if the West Indies were great again? But what are you doing about it, right?
mm.
Like, you just have your hands in your pocket. I know the landscape of cricket has changed, but if you really care about West Indies cricket, you would do something about it. You would make sure they don't play just 18 tests, they play more. There is an incentive for them to play more, even if it means broadcast rights will not get you the kind of money you want. So it's that as well, and maybe it's a very utopian thought. Like, you can argue, why should BCCI or Cricket Australia care about West Indies coming back and being competitive? But I mean, if world cricket as a whole loves to romanticize about it, they need to help the West Indies prop up and at least reach a point where they're competitive. Otherwise, look, I know this has been debated, and I'm sure you guys have done episodes on this. The whole disbanding of the West Indies as a concept, and people have started talking about it, like, even with, like, some very learned voices on West Indies cricket. When you post this question to them, they're like, "Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, we won't go out and talk about it in the open because they feel that they can't,
Mm.
but it's very much a possibility. If not now, then in the next 10 years, we might well reach that point, especially in terms of Test cricket."
Well, people, you were sitting when this episode started. You're like, what are these two gonna kind of concoct? Looking at the Australia versus West Indies, reviewing that Australia versus West Indies series, we've covered a lot. We've gone from West Indies to India to England, back to West Indies, and Barrett has ended it with, well, maybe there's only 10 years left in this whole thing. so, so, listen, Barrett, people don't realize that as we've recorded this, as soon as I press stop, I'm running to work.
Yes.
So thank you for giving up your time, Barrett. Like I say, people, this
No
has been a
problem at all.
crossover episode. So whichever particular audience you are, whether you're a West Indies on 99.94 or whether you're Australia on 99.94, please do go and listen to it on whichever particular medium you prefer, and just listen in general to 99.94, because you get really in-depth conversations and chats like this that you probably won't find anywhere else. Thank you, Barra. I'll leave you the last word, and then I'll think it's goodbye from me.
Oh no, I mean, I look, I even though I have kind of given a deadline to West Indies cricket, I will keep rallying around the West Indies. You know that. But just going back to what you were saying, this is the platform where you will get to hear about Bruno San Martino in Australia versus West Indies. So yeah, you should sign up and listen to us talk about stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's when I see you, I can't help but start talking wrestling. So maybe once you're done with work and we get hit the weekend, maybe we should have another recording. And when Santoki is back, we need to have like a get together or coming together of cricket and wrestling. I've told Jared I'm going to bring Jeff Jarrett on very soon. So maybe we should have Jeff Jarrett on, and like he's so into his cricket these days that we should have a little chat with him.
No better way to end the episode. Ladies and gents, it's goodbye from me. It's goodbye from Barrett. Stay locked in for some more episodes coming up.